Welcome everyone. My name is Carla Brinker and I'm a Principal Cybersecurity Consultant with GuidePoint Security. I'm here to teach you a little bit about using a responsibility matrix. So in our environments today, we have lots of different moving pieces, different shapes, different sizes. We're trying to make them all fit together so there are no gaps and no holes in our controls. This is easier done when it's done in-house, but then when there's a third-party service provider involved, it's more difficult to understand what they're doing on a day-to-day basis, to what depth or degree they're doing the control, and if it satisfies what the PCI DSS wants. The whole idea of being an assessed entity is to track what every service provider is doing, so you have a decent level of confidence to make sure your DSS requirements are met. Even if you outsource your responsibilities to a third-party provider, you as the assessed entity are still responsible for keeping your data secure. So how do we do that, and how do we get all of these pieces to come together like that? We track all of the different responsibilities from each of those service providers. The easiest way for me to do that is I use a matrix. Now, a responsibility matrix is not a requirement of the PCI DSS. It's just one way that I'm going to show you. You can get any type of responsibility statement that you want from the service providers as long as all of the PCI DSS requirements are covered. Typically, your responsibility matrix is part of your overall third-party oversight program. Just one of the small pieces. We won't cover the entire oversight program in this presentation. So when I'm doing an assessment, 12.8.5 seems to be a challenge for almost every assessed entity. Why? Because they seldom have all of their service providers documented. Some people don't even know what a service provider is. I ask them for their service provider list and I get a blank stare. Hopefully this will help you out. So for some of your service providers, the card brands actually have a registry of service providers. These lists are fantastic for knowing which service providers are actually PCI compliant, but that doesn't actually fulfill 12.8.5. These registries are informational only, and they give an idea of what types of services that service provider might be compliant for, but it doesn't help you fulfill the requirement. The only way to fulfill that requirement is to get the service provider's AOC. The attestation of compliance comes with the report of compliance and shows you that who the signing QSA was, what services were actually deemed compliant, and if that pertains to the service they're offering to you. Now sometimes when I go to an assessed entity and I'm performing the assessment, they'll just print out the registry and say, here, they're PCI compliant. Well, yeah, they're PCI compliant, but I need to know what the dates are, what's their compliance date that the AOC was signed, and I need to see their actual AOC. Then we can start talking about their responsibilities and what they do for the person that's being assessed. It doesn't have anything to do, the registry doesn't have anything to do with what they're actually doing for that particular assessed entity. The other thing that happens is they'll show me an AOC and they'll say, here, this is what they do for us. Well, that AOC actually is for the service provider's environment. And again, it doesn't have anything to do with what they're providing you, the assessed entity. I need to see the responsibility matrix in order to take that one step farther for a better understanding. So a long story short, and I'm not big into reading slides, this is the definition that the council gives us for a service provider. This is where people struggle. There are many different kinds of service providers. The ones that have the cardholder data are easy to identify. Everybody seems to understand those. But then there are the service providers that are connected to your CDE. They are also in scope. They may not have cardholder data, and they'll be quick to tell you, I don't have any PCI responsibility. But as your scoping exercise will show, connected to is also in scope. Well then, there's the security impacting service providers. Those are the ones that they don't have cardholder data either, but they are the ones that are fulfilling some of your controls. They may have access into your CDE, they may just performing security controls for you. Either way, they're a service provider and are subject to the whole requirement of 12.8. And then, of course, there's one last definition, a nested third-party service provider, or also known as a fourth-party service provider. This happens when you, the assessed entity, hire a company, and that company has to hire another company to fulfill part of the contract with you. That makes so company A is who you hire, company B is who the company A hires. For your assessment, you only need to worry about company A, but you should be aware of the company B, or the nested service provider, in case there's a breach in that vendor and it may impact your data. Now, IDing these is rather difficult. The only way to understand if your service provider is using a nested third-party service provider is to look at their AOC, and they will be listed in the AOC so that you can monitor their status. Now, the Council has given us a fantastic information supplement. Granted, it's from 2016, and it's version 3.2.1, but everything still applies today. What I like most about this information supplement is that it has a list of service providers where you can look for service providers, but it's certainly not an exhaustive list, nor could it ever be. But it's a great place to start to get more familiar with identifying service providers in your environment. So there are some exceptions for responsibility statements that you don't have to collect. Your payment brands, they're definitely doing services for you, but you don't have to collect a responsibility statement or an AOC. The same with the acquirer. Now, more and more acquirers are providing AOCs and responsibility statements, but it's not a requirement. And the last thing that I wanted to point out is you don't have to try to chase your internet service providers. They are not your internet service provider by name, but they're not a service provider as required to include in your assessment. Sometimes you can be an internet service provider as well. For instance, if your corporation has a third party who's serving your cafe, and they're doing the cooking and the payment exceptions and accepting credit cards, you do not have to declare yourself as a service provider just because you are giving them internet access for their card reader, as long as their card reader is encrypted. If literally all you're doing is internet service provider or providing the internet connection, you are not a service provider. So who needs a responsibility matrix? Nobody. Who needs a responsibility statement? Everybody. In order for you to fulfill 12.8.5, the tracking of the requirements for each service provider and assessed entity has to be documented. The easiest way for me is the matrix. It's not a requirement, but it's also a tool that you can use as the assessed entity to track all of your service providers. So whether you have a column, one for each service provider and then one for you being the assessed entity, and you track which requirements are yours, or you can even do it by payment channel. So this is what I set up for my responsibility matrix as an assessed entity. I'll have one column for service provider one, insert their name to make it easier, but then on the right is the assessed entity. Some of these requirements will be shared. Some of them will be the responsibility of all three. It may differ by payment channel. So depending on the size of the organization and the number of service providers, I may use a checkbox or a check mark in the box. Other approaches, I'll actually put the payment channel for which the service provider is providing that control. But this is the type of matrix, and of course it's much longer, but this is the type of matrix that I use to track those responsibilities. Now, the way that I start building one of these is the council has given us the prioritized approach spreadsheet. I go out, I download a fresh copy, hide a bunch of columns, insert my own columns, and the majority of the work is done as far as building the template. And then it's time to start populating, and away we go. So this is a summary slide that just basically overviews the matrix. Not quite sure how an assessed entity could manage without a matrix, especially when there's many service providers involved, but this is just a summary to help you recap. So when do you do the responsibility matrix? It's certainly not just a one-time thing, like most things in PCI. When you're onboarding a new service provider, you need to understand what they're actually going to do for you before you implement their services. Understand what PCI requirements they're going to fulfill for you, and which ones are going to be yours and how you're going to share that responsibility to close all the gaps. Then additionally, each year, you're going to want to review that responsibility matrix and make sure that it's still accurate. Now, it might happen that there's a significant change throughout the year with that service provider, and you have to do it in mid-cycle as well. For instance, if a service provider is on-prem and they suddenly go to the cloud, that's a significant change, and you're going to want to make sure that every control that they fulfill for you is still being fulfilled in the new environment. Another significant change might be if the service provider has a bunch of layoffs, or if they're acquired. You're going to want to research that and make sure the responsibilities are still the same and both parties understand and agree what they're expected to be doing. Keep in mind, the service provider is going to accept as little responsibility as possible. This is why the two-way communication is essential. So what do you do if you can't get a matrix from a service provider? This happens quite frequently, actually. The security impacting service providers and the connected to service providers will say, I don't have cardholder data, I don't have any PCI responsibility. Why are you asking me for this? I don't have to be PCI compliant. Well, as you know, it's much better to do business with a PCI compliant vendor to make this step a whole lot easier. But if you have a vendor who is non-compliant, work with them. If they will not provide you a matrix after you've given them a template and they won't fill it out, fill out your own with the responsibilities you think they have, and then try to come to agreement and make sure that everybody understands. Now, there are times when the third-party service provider will be non-responsive and have absolutely nothing to do with this process. That does not failure rock. What it will do is you document your communication efforts throughout the year. Show that they're non-responsive. You create the responsibility matrix for your assessor. If it's a critical vendor or if you have an acquirer or compliance accepting entity, contact them and say, I have this issue, what would you like me to do? If it's a critical vendor, you may very well need to escalate. If you're unable to get a responsibility statement from the third-party service provider, the assessor will still document the service provider in section 4.4 of the ROC. It will just indicate that the service provider was not included in this assessment. They may make a note that they were unable to communicate with them, etc., but it does not failure rock. So some of the gotchas that I've seen to try to help you out so that you don't make the same mistakes. Many times I'll get a matrix where the responsibilities just don't make sense. For instance, a lot of times I will see incident response is outsourced to a third-party service provider. At the very best, incident response is shared. For years, we've been taught the weakest link is the employee. So we need to make sure that the employees are reporting suspicious behavior. It's a shared responsibility. It cannot be 100% on a third-party service provider. The other thing that I see that's completely outsourced is vendor oversight. If you have a vendor oversight program or a vendor oversight platform, they can certainly assist you in providing your due diligence reviews, but at no time can they do this in a bubble, and it cannot be completely theirs. You need to tell that vendor who the service providers are for oversight and what roles they're providing before they can do their work. Again, it's a shared responsibility. One of my favorites is when patching comes back and nobody's responsible. Patching is somebody's responsibility always. It depends on who owns the application. Is the application owned by the vendor, or did they just code it and give it to you and you have to provide the patches? That all has to be worked out in advance and make sure patching isn't missed. Cloud is another good one. I'm in the cloud, I don't have any responsibility. Well, maybe, could be, but a lot of times the cloud provider will provide the firewall, but you have to configure the firewall rules. Again, it's a shared responsibility, and they are a service provider that you need to provide oversight for. Cloud is also notorious for they'll set the password rules, but you have to do the user management. So therefore, again, it's a shared responsibility. Now for these service providers that are not compliant, you have to include them in your audit or in your assessment. That means you need to have a right to audit in your contract. That way you can ask them questions and make sure that the controls that they're providing for you are sufficient for the PCI DSS. So in summary, providing an overview of all the third parties is a very difficult task, especially when many service providers are involved. You'll want to track all the responsibilities, you want to review them at least yearly and after every significant change, and you'll want to make sure everyone is in agreement. Hopefully this presentation has been helpful. It's been my pleasure to present, and I thank you for your time.